Welcome, Spartans, to the Podcast Evolved Book Club. I am your host, Aaron, and with me today we have Oran.
Hey, everybody.
And we've got Krysta.
Hey, everybody.
And we've got enthusiasm with Krysta.
Or sarcasm.
Yeah, a little bit of both. And this time we're talking about the impossible life and possible death of Preston J. Cole. That's one mouthful of a title.
I know.
Yeah, I can't wait to put that in the title of the book club, and that be the...
That's gonna be the entire thing.
So when you see it on your phone, it will say The Impossible Light.
Yeah, that's pretty much it with the podcast. It definitely doesn't work. Abbreviations all around.
You should just put in big bold letters, Cole.
That's pretty much all you need to know. It's Cole. So let's run through some of the details before we start. This is an Eric Nylund story.
Yay!
Personally, I think one of his best stories. I like this one a lot. This came as part of Halo Evolutions, published by Tor Books. It's your usual paperbacks, ebooks, and audiobooks.
It's
Audiobook
in
version's
volume
quite
1.
good, by the way. Oh yes, it's also in volume 1 of the re-release that they did.
Yeah, and it starts on 252.
And this was originally published on the 24th of the 11th, 09, 8 years ago.
That's a long time ago.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
I feel so old.
So I think we'll dive into this first with just a brief rundown of this book this story. If you haven't read it, it's possibly the longest story in Evolutions by far. And this pretty much covers all of Preston Cole's, as it says, all of his life and the possibility of his death. But it's also a great insight into how the UNSC evolved from their early days colonizing space right up until the Covenant, and it covers a lot of really interesting things. So
it's also in a really interesting format.
Yeah, how it's told, I think, is very highlighted.
Yeah, this is it's written in the form of a report from someone called Codename Surgeon within ONI, and he's writing the report to someone called Usual Suspects. And this is basically his report and his theory, taking all the evidence into account of, does he think Preston Cole died, or does he think Preston Cole, something else happened to him? So as you run through this story, it sets up his life, his career, everything that happened, and then his final battle with the Covenant, and what they think the aftermath of that is. So do we want to run through this kind of roughly, or do we just want to chat about what we enjoyed in it?
We can go through it roughly.
Let's go through it. Yeah, let's just go through it, and we'll just chime in on stuff that we thought was cool.
The early part of the report covers basically Cole's childhood. So we find out he's the son of a farmer. I think he's one of 7 siblings. His parents are Quakers. He comes across, they talk about him in school reports and stuff. He's a pretty gifted child. It's obvious from a young age. They talk about him how he tends to overthink things, and anything he doesn't know he looks up, but he doesn't seem to have much fun or anything. And then at the end they go, and for a 10-year-old this is a little bit strange. And they're going when they talk about him, he sounds like they're talking about some sort of teenager.
Yeah.
Even as a kid he sounds like he's kind of out there. They move on from his early childhood into, he qualifies school and he doesn't have many options, so he signs up to be an enlisted man with the UNSC as they ship people out to the colonies. So his early career then, he's a crewman. I forget the name of the ship he was on at the time. I didn't have it written down there, but he's a crewman for 1 year on this ship. And they talk about the incident that got him into officer training, where the officers on the ship are kind of dicks, and one of the officers gets him to basically do his homework for him and work out some slip space calculations. The guy buggers off and leaves Cole on the bridge on his own to do this, and then the commander notices Cole in the corner. He's like, "What are you still doing here?" And Cole gives him his work. Cole goes on his way, and then the commander and the AI between them realize that Cole figured out a new way to calculate slip space jumps,
and he did it accurately,
plus or minus a little bit. It was it's correct, but it's still a little rough. But it's
basically, I think the AI says something like, a human could never really work this out properly, she says, but I think she says something like, I've never seen it figured out this way before and it would work. It's kind of impressive that he could do something like that on his own. That commander recommends him for officer training, and he goes to officer training on like Luna Academy.
Well, I was gonna say to put some names in here because I have it up here. His title is Crewman Cole, just as like a entry level person, and then Lieutenant Commander Neville is the Lieutenant Commander of the Season of Plenty.
Season of Plenty, that's the ship.
Yeah, and the other officer that gave Cole the assignment is Seisman. I don't know what his title is, but he leaves him there for like 5 hours.
Yeah, he's sitting there doing calculations.
Because like they do like the first scene, so to speak, and then it's like, and then for the next 5 hours the crew does their work, and then Neville just like stumbles upon him, and he's like, yeah, it is like, what are you doing there, crewman? And he goes, oh, just doing what I was ordered to do, sir. It was a very nice interaction, because he was like, just like, okay, we'll carry on, thank you. And he says, no problem, sir, and just like walks away, like, just like, yep, I'm just doing my job.
Doing what I was told to do.
At no point does he figure out he's been sort of like dicked over by the other guy. He just does his work and he's in it. He goes for officer training, and there's an incident at the end of officer training where there's a run-in with an admiral's daughter, and the basic gist of the incident seemed to be people were sneaking off the base, and someone was having relations with the admiral's daughter, Ina Volkov, she's called, and during like a tribunal hearing, Cole refuses to say anything about if he knew people were leaving the base or anything else, and they threaten him with a court-martial, but then shortly after that, everything's closed up, and said Admiral marries Cole to his daughter, who is pregnant, but it is later revealed that Cole is not the father of the child. So there's like speculation by Surgeon as to, did Cole do this as like a sense of chivalry, that he took this woman, this girl on and married her and to be a father to her child, or did he see an opportunity to get in the good books of this admiral and push his career forward, or was it a case of a little bit of both? They don't really get too much into it, but he then goes on, I think, to have 3 more children with Ina Volkov.
He has a bunch of kids with her.
Yeah, like maybe even 4.
They weren't getting on too badly for all that. So then he passes out and becomes an officer. I think he's an officer on the Las Vegas.
Yes.
And this is when they're fighting insurrectionists, and they mention like this is a pretty important part in his career, the Callisto incident, which I quite like. Is there's a UNSC ship called the Callisto is stolen by insurrectionists. They hijack it after, I think they're running like blockade duty, and they're checking ships for contraband, and then some insurrectionists flush the crew out an airlock and steal this, I don't know if it's like a frigate or just like a little cruiser ship. So they steal this, and now the insurrectionists are armed, so the UNSC send 3 more ships out to hunt it down, including the Las Vegas, which Cole is on. And this is the first time, the UNSC have like a proper engagement in space with anyone.
Yeah, the ships, it was mentioned that the ships aren't actually built for combat at this point in time. They're literally just built to, make colonies.
Yeah, like they have
stuff.
missiles and that, but they don't have like the titanium A armor or anything.
They're just like buses. They're big buses.
Basically, so they chase down this Callisto and it disappears off into an asteroid field, and then as the 3 ships go in to attack it, the insurrectionists detonate a nuke in an asteroid and take out one of the ships completely and damage the other 2. And then the insurrectionists try to board the Las Vegas after Cole puts out a distress call that they need help.
Also, everyone on the bridge is dead.
I was gonna say, like he's the only surviving member on the bridge, and he's just a second lieutenant, and so he takes control of as acting commander, and it's cool because they even cut away in the middle of this scene, and they have his ship log where it's his captain's report, and he kind of recounts everything as it happened, as I assume the role, so anything prior to this isn't my doing, but everything after of that is my responsibility, and I take full account for, or whatever. This is set up very nicely.
He records that because he specifically pulls a really dodgy move here, where he puts out a distress call and the Callisto comes alongside and docks with his ship. But it turns out that whilst the Callisto was getting ready to dock, he had the crew take the last torpedo from the tubes and put it in the airlock, and he launches the torpedo through the airlock into the Callisto and destroys their slipspace core, and then they take control of the Callisto and eventually survive, and he saves the day. But as it mentions at the end of this incident, is like Cole essentially removed the ability for the UNSC to put out a mayday call in enemy space because no one would ever trust them again.
At least with insurrectionists.
Yeah, this is maritime law, and it said up until this point, all captains and military were sticklers for it, that if someone made a distress call, you answered it, and he was the first person to really, like, abuse this whole thing. And it even, like, I like the touch where they say that the UNSC can't decide whether they should discipline him or give him a medal so they don't do anything. They just leave it as is and say, well, if we don't discipline him or we don't give him a medal, we're not encouraging this behaviour. But if he hadn't have done this, they would have been lost. And the insurrectionists, because they really did have them, all the two ships left were completely crippled. There was no way they could have survived otherwise. He knew that he couldn't allow the insurrectionists to get a second ship.
So he's like, okay.
Yeah, so that's it. So he pulls this move, he gets the insurrectionists, and then from there he gets a promotion and gets command of his own ship, the UNSC Gorgon. And now at this stage, this is when the UNSC are starting to get like properly into space combat, because the Gorgon is the first ship, I believe, to come with a Mach gun.
Yeah.
During this stage of his time, he's running missions in the outer colonies, and he has 3 run-ins with a ship called the Bellicose, which is another hijacked and stolen UNSC ship. What happens? Once he beat them, once they beat him, and once they fought each other to a stalemate, was what happened.
No, I thought they just got away, like, they escaped 2 times and then they came out a draw. Because if he beat him...
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, if he beat them...
If he beat him, then he would have the ship. No, but, like, I think, yeah, so the first 2 engagements they got away, and then the 3rd engagement that they kind of highlight in detail is where they kind of got into a draw.
I think that's what it is. I think once they beat him and escaped, once they just escaped outright, and then on the 3rd time they fought to a stalemate until they had no weapons left. And then he has this little text interaction with the captain of the Bellicose. He doesn't know who it is, but they just have this little back and forth about how, you know, I think the captain says to him, if you ever get bored of fighting for the UNSC, maybe come and fight with the good guys.
Yeah, it was something along those lines.
They have like a witty back and forth, and he's like, well, sure, tell you what, come on over to my ship and you can convince me of it in person. And the other captain's like, yeah, nice try. And he's like, well, sure, why don't you come over here? And he's like, I think you might have some missiles left, so if it's all the same, we'll just leave it at that. So this ship escapes, and I think then he says at this stage, he takes a break on one of the outer colony worlds, because he writes a message to his brother and he's like, before I let the Bellicose become my Moby Dick, we're going to take a break on this nice little like tropical planet where he talks about beaches with red sand and how it might be an operating base for his ship out here. And he forms a friendship with a woman that runs the bar on the beach, who happens to be an astrophysicist who gave it all up to come and pour drinks in the outer colonies.
Well, I also want to touch what he was mentioning in the beginning of the short story, how people were giving up their jobs just to go and move into the new outer colonies to have a small life. And that was something that Cole was like thinking about doing. Like, you know, do I want to, since he grew up in like a farmer's family, to go out into this outer colonies and look up at the stars and see stars that you don't like remember or
he
see. He
comes across as like very envious of this whole thing. And the other thing he says is as well, like, all these people that shipped out to the outer colonies, he said, is like, these are super smart people. Like, they're all scientists, medical professionals, engineers, people that wanted to give it all up to, I think he says, like, become blacksmiths and herd sheep and just throw themselves against the elements on far-flung planets. And he really admires this, but he also makes the point that, like, the colonies are full of a lot of really intelligent people. Those were the inner colonies, and then he said, like, the outer colonies, when they formed again. To go back to Cole's childhood, actually, he writes a report as a kid where he basically predicts the insurrection. Surgeon talks about how he was almost prophetic in that he talks about how Earth spawns the inner colonies, and then the inner colonies spawn the outer colonies, and the outer colonies are so far removed from Earth that they have no attachment or loyalty to Earth. And this is basically what these people are. So the likes of this, let's say his new friend, the barman at the beach, Lorraine Castilla, I think she's how you pronounce it. He meets her, and as I said, like, she's an astrophysicist. She even teaches him a way to improve his ship's reactor and that. So he becomes friendly with her, and then eventually, through letters to his brother, he mentions that they've got married, and then I believe she was pregnant.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, like, they get married, and they're out there, and during this time, he says, like, the insurrectionist activities pretty much die away, apart from a small handful of little skirmishes here and there. It's not on the same scale that it was. And then he gets a letter from Admiral Stanforth.
Someone at Oni or something.
I think it's Admiral Stanforth on Reach.
Yeah, Admiral Harold Stafford, commanding officer of the UNSC
He's like,
Leviathan.
you fucked up this time, Cole.
Well, not really. He didn't. He was like, dude, we need to talk. There's been a development.
Your girl's cheating on you.
Because, like, he said that he believes that Cole was duped. Like, he doesn't think that, because, like, he was like, CENTCOM might think you were selling secrets to her, but I don't think you'd do that.
Yeah, so basically he writes to say to them, it's like, Oni have just realized that your wife is the commander of the UNSC within the area. She's the captain of the Bellicose. Or, well, no, I don't think he knows that she's the captain of the Bellicose.
No, she's like
just
the
a
leader,
top...
like a top.
Yeah, she's like
of
a
the
top ship
insurrection.
commander in the Insurrectionist, and she's married to you, and Oni aren't happy at all. It's like, and they're coming for you. It's like, you have 3 hours. If you can find her first and bring her in, do it, and it'll help your case. So anyway, Cole gets brought back to Reach. He's given, I think they call it the debriefing of his life, and then he's put on desk duty, and he's basically ignored until he gets the chance to retire. Like, he keeps trying to get back into space, and they don't give him any opportunity. He keeps writing reports on how to improve combat capabilities, and they ignore him. And then they give him like a token promotion to Vice Admiral and retire him. And then he spends his days, I think, mostly at home drinking, apart from they mention a couple of his scandalous marriages to much younger women that ended in scandalous divorces. Because at this stage, the thing is, the UNSC have turned Cole into like a star in the UNSC. Everyone knows who Preston Cole is. He's famous. But at this stage now that he's been out of the limelight for so long, like, his star has faded, and he spends his days in his house drinking. They talk about how he gets new flash-cloned livers and organs, and everything's fine until the Covenant attack.
Did you say what happened to the Bellicose?
Oh, yes, we have to cover that as well. Shortly after Cole's taken back to Reach, the Bellicose is in a fight with some UNSC ships and falls into a planet's atmosphere and is lost with all hands.
Yeah, so she's dead.
Yeah, she loses power,
dead.
she falls into the planet, it's gone. And then that was the other thing they mentioned, is that the people debriefing Cole and Reach told him this, thinking it would break his spirits. But that surgeon says what actually happened is because Cole realised she was dead, her reputation had to be protected at all costs, so he basically doesn't tell them anything. They don't get anything out of him, and then they string him up in desk duty until they get rid of him. So then there's a report from 2 ONI agents that are sent to Cole's house to see can they bring him back in, because the UNSC are organising a task force to go to Harvest to destroy the Covenant ship that attacked. This is shortly after the first incident. I forget the name of there's 3 ships are sent to Harvest to engage the cruiser in orbit, and 2 of them are destroyed in like the first 12 seconds, and the 3rd ship barely escapes.
No, the Hercules.
The Hercules, that's it. And then Cole is given this fleet of 40 ships, and it's his job to go back to Harvest and take this ship out. These 2 guys come, they show him the report and all the info, and they say, like, when they arrived at the house, he answers the door in his bathrobe, he's scruffy, he's drunk. There's books stacked everywhere, though, and they note, like these are real books made of paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, oh my god.
Yeah, and they're with titles I can barely
What a
understand.
freak.
He reads this report, and then he has a drink, and he disappears off into the bedroom, and then he reappears in his uniform, clean shaven, and he's immediately like, let's do this. So he's given orders, he wants AIs, he wants ships, he wants crew and all this stuff, and then he takes this fleet and he heads out to Harvest to engage this ship. Now, I'm a little fuzzy on the details of this because I'm starting to mix battles together. this is the first time where they engage a Covenant ship properly, so I think they lose quite a few ships in the initial engagement. And then Cole comes up with the idea of hitting the ship with missiles, then archers, then nukes to bring down the Covenant shields. He studies, I think, the way the shields, the energy patterns of the shields as he watches it. And like this becomes a mainstay of, like in the other books, like Fall of Reach and Contact Harvest. Different people like Captain Keyes and that use this, where they'll pound a Covenant shields with maybe 2 or 3 Mac rounds, and the third Mac round will always pierce the shields and damage the ship, because the shields can take so much punishment. But Cole is the first person to work this out, so he gets his entire fleet to hit them with their missiles, then their Macs, then their nukes, and they take this ship out.
But what they specifically do, though, I think, is they like pick a point, and because like I think the way the shields work is that when you fire it, the energy is then displaced across the whole of the shield. So then I think the way that he told the AI and all of his other remaining ships after the initial attack is to fire on like a single point and like delay all instead of everything firing like literally at once across, they kind of fire in succession, so it would like
it's
hit
just constantly
and then hit.
getting hit.
Just constantly berated in that one spot until it broke, and then the archer missiles or the Mac rounds would like make it through, and a good blast ended up blowing the ship from the inside.
Yeah, and I think they mentioned in this he loses about a third of his fleet in this engagement, and then they talk about numerous engagements after that where he might have fought 12 Covenant ships and he might have lost 20 of his. Or I think at one stage, like, he fights 8 Covenant ships and he loses 30 of his.
It's always interesting to look back on early Halo and see how much they were struggling to kill Covenant ships, and now we just have a ship that literally just fucking rams them. We have the fucking Infinity flying through Covenant cruisers.
Yeah, like, this is really the early days. They've got no weapon, or they've got very few weapons that can tackle them. Like, if it wasn't for the Mac guns, they really wouldn't stand a chance. And their armor's just not up to the challenge at all, because the Covenant plasma just tears straight through the ships, and that's the end of them. So he talks about all these numerous engagements, and I think at one point, Surgeon says, for any normal commander, this probably would have broken them, because they basically wanted him to do the equivalent of like fight the Battle of Stalingrad, followed by the Battle of Trafalgar, followed by the Alamo, over and over and over, back to back, and he's just constantly losing men. He says, like, any other battle group would have been disbanded, but because the UNSC had no other option and Cole was the only thing keeping them alive, they just had to keep reinforcing him, so he had to keep sending more people to their deaths.
Here's the quote. It's, imagine fighting Stalingrad and Coal Harbor and defending the hot gates with 300 Spartans and repelling the Mexican army at the Alamo, and then having to repeat those lopsided impossible fights over and over.
Yeah, that's it. Like, they're sort of saying, like, they kept reinforcing him and they just prayed that nothing would make Cole snap.
And nothing did, really.
No, really, not until a certain point. But one other thing to mention is, while all this is happening, this is when Cole develops the Cole Protocol. So he has a couple of things that he comes to realize. First he comes up with the Cole Protocol, which is basically, they've realized that the Covenant are trying to find Earth, but he can't for the life of him figure out how they haven't found it already, because he says, like, really, all you need to do is drop an antenna in space and listen for the signals and trace them back to Earth. He says it's really simple, but for some reason the Covenant can't do it. So he theorizes that there's something possibly within the Covenant that's preventing them, or like he has a couple of theories, but he says that without understanding their motivations, he can't really be sure how to fight them. But then he says that all ships that engage the Covenant have to wipe their nav drives, so that's part of the Cole Protocol, and all ships escaping Covenant fleets have to jump away from human space to cut down on, so that, like, the Covenant won't follow a ship back to the next planet.
Yeah, it's to jump to a random point, to do a couple random slip space jumps, and then jump to Earth.
And I think they say that had it not been for Cole and the Cole Protocol, they estimate that the Covenant would have cut their way through the colonies to Earth in about 3 years.
Yeah, and instead it took, 10 years or something crazy like that? Longer.
Closer to 20.
Yeah, it was a long time.
Because at this stage, we're talking...
They didn't find Earth until 2552, and so
so this is around now when Cole starts to fight the Covenant.
25-28?
25-25. is when he comes back to
okay.
service to fight the Covenant.
Okay, so yeah.
He took Harvest back in 2526.
So, 27 years he was able to keep the Covenant away from Earth, basically.
Yeah, he goes for quite a long time in this. I think, he's up until 2543 is when Cole eventually disappears. But he sets up everything that the UNSC are going to rely on for the rest of their engagement with the Covenant. So he sets the Cole Protocol in motion. He develops different tactics to fight them. I even like how they mention in the report they caught an elite prisoner during the Battle of Harvest, and they talk about how he just spits constant vitriol, and they realize this is some sort of religious thing, because they talk about how the elite just constantly, even as he dies on the operating table bleeding out, he just keeps talking about how he'll burn the humans from the stars and all the rest of it.
And this is when he finds out that he suspects there's something in the Covenant hierarchy that is making this happen. At this point, he's already suspected that there's some kind of lies being spread from the prophets. He didn't know there were prophets at the time, but from the prophets to the rest of the Covenant.
Yeah, and there's also whatever it is, they either don't know where Earth is, or as he theorizes, they're not as interested in Earth as some sort of ritual of just cleansing humanity from the galaxy, one planet at a time. Oh, and at this point, he also talks about how he hopes the UNSC have put other plans in motion, like sending a colony ship off to some far-flung planet in the galaxy to start again, which, by the way, there's a Halo book. I know it's basically the plot to Mass Effect Andromeda, but I'll take that Halo book, please.
Yeah, that would be a great Halo book.
Where they start again. All this is culminating in what's going to be Cole's final battle. Bear with me on this one as I try to remember this. Cole assembles one last fleet to take out a massive Covenant fleet that's gathering at Psi Serpentis, I believe is the system, and it's a colossal gas giant. So he gathers up this big human fleet, slip spaces into the solar system on one side of the gas giant, and there's so many human ships. I think it's the largest UNSC fleet ever assembled. A ton of the ships, when they slip space in, cause a massive distortion within the gas giant's atmosphere, like a ripple that goes around the planet to where the Covenant fleet are, and a whole chunk of them break off to come and intercept. He then does a second slip space jump with the fleet, where they move around to another part of the planet and ambush the other half of the Covenant that are still there. Am I getting this right so far?
Yes.
And then they engage... we're going to have to remember this because there's a lot going on. Actually, I suppose we missed one bit in the middle of all this. Before this battle, there's a report comes into Cole, because he's the commander of everything in the sector, where a ship engaging the Covenant gets help from a fleet of mystery vessels, and one of them matches the description of the Bellicose.
Yeah, and he's talking about he's seen a ghost or something.
It's identified as the Bellicose as well.
This commander says they never spoke to his fleet, but he sent them a thanks and then went on. And Surgeon then goes on to theorize that with news that the Bellicose had been spotted again, this put a series of plans in Cole's mind into motion. They mention that Cole, at this point on, stops recording personal logs and then makes a series of requests and decisions that, with hindsight, can be seen as suspicious, but at the time didn't really stand out. So he orders... What does he order? He basically changes out a ton of crew on his ship, the Gorgon. He gets a whole new replacement load of hull armor delivered for the Gorgon, and he has slip space calculations. He gets Stanforth to run them through the Reach AIs about slip spacing in an atmosphere. So he has all this done and all these things prepared, and then he goes to the Battle of Psi Serpentis. So I say he slips in, he then jumps again to the other part of the system. He then engages half the fleet, and they manage to... I think they use the gas giant's radiation to render, and magnetic fields to render the Covenant plasma ineffective, and then they're able to take out a good chunk of the Covenant fleet this way, aren't they?
Yes.
You're going to have to run through me with this, because I'm trying to remember the battle in my head, and it's now started to blur a little bit.
That's fine.
I know they take out the first half, and then they get reinforcements from the Bellicose again, don't they?
I thought the Bellicose just kind of showed up at the last sort of
They show up to help with this first part of the fleet. They show up, attack them, and then they do the same thing again. They like slip in and slip out. And then Cole sends out an encoded message to the rest of his ships. But he has the message set to erase, so they don't know what was said, but then his other ships start to pull back. And the second half of the Covenant fleet that they led off around the planet earlier are coming back to re-engage that fleet. And then Cole gets on the comms and basically sends a fuck you message to the Covenant.
Yeah.
It's this sort of like, you guys think yous are great holy warriors, like I have destroyed many of your holy, abominations of ships. It's like, I am the Preston Cole, I am here on the flagship, come and get me. And he takes his ship down into the atmosphere of the gas giant. And then, of course, the Covenant take the bait. And about face, they ignore his fleet as they retreat. And they come back into the atmosphere for Cole. And then Cole basically does a sleight of hand where he launches a load of his missiles up out of the planet's atmosphere at the Covenant. But they're nothing more than a light show. And they sort of like mask where he is.
Yeah, blind them a little bit.
And he, at the same time, he launches a load of his nukes down into the planet's atmosphere and detonates them, because this gas giant is like a tiny amount of mass away from becoming a brown dwarf star. He launches the nukes down in. They cause a reaction that makes the gas giant ignite. And the gas giant, it supernovas and destroys the Covenant fleet, but it also destroys the Gorgon. So, like
the Everest.
Oh no, that's right. It's the Everest.
Yeah, he's the Everest in this fight.
That's okay. I forgot that. I'm getting confused between my ships now. So the Everest seems to be destroyed. The system report is that they say they found the right amount of debris in the atmosphere to account for the Everest's armor, but there seems to be a severe lack of other elements that you'd expect that would make up the ship. So this is at the point where Surgeon starts to theorize that the request that Cole made earlier for the replacement armor was actually part of a decoy, where he theorizes that Cole used his calculations for how to slip space out of the planet's atmosphere, so that he jumped before the planet ignited and left the armor behind, so that there would be enough material in the atmosphere to make it look like his ship was destroyed, but he actually escaped whilst the Covenant fleet was wiped out, which is pretty cool.
And it's also theorized that he started his life with a bunch of crew members on a distant planet.
Well, because they were saying that if he did that, there was the whole crew, and so he'd have to. Because they're theorizing, is like, okay, well, if he does that and he abandons ship and hops on a decoy ship and leaves, well, what about the whole crew? He either lets the whole crew die and he leaves himself, or the whole crew goes with him. So he would have had to talk with them and make sure that they were okay with leaving their lives behind, or because all of them are supposedly lost with all hands as well.
Before this, he changed a whole load of his key crew out, so he theorizes that many of those could have been people that he believed were sympathetic to his cause, he says, but he still can't see how every crewman on the Everest would have been for this, so he wonders, Cole doesn't seem like the sort of person that would flush them out the airlock, so he theorizes, did these other people, were they left in cryo on his ship or something? What happened? But they've no real way to know, and then he wonders, would Cole then have jumped and rendezvoused with the Bellicose and the rest of, the insurrectionist ghost fleet? And did they then go off and set up a new colony? Because they talk about how years after this, there are several reports of engagements between Covenant and human ships that aren't the UNSC. And there are even a few mentions of ghost ships intervening to save people from the Covenant. So he theorizes that Cole could still be out there somewhere, living his little fantasy he had of living on a farm under an alien sky, somewhere far away from the UNSC and everything that came with it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great story.
It is. It's really the sort of thing. I know it's in Evolutions, but this could have so easily just been a full novel.
It could have, yeah.
It's the longest story in Evolutions, and it really wouldn't take much more just to fill this out into a full book, which would have been awesome.
Well, maybe we'll eventually get something with Cole, I'm sure. They left it so open-ended.
Yeah, I assume at some point Cole will make a reappearance.
He's gonna reappear when Cortana's going nuts, and he's gonna be like, what the fuck did you guys do?
I'd imagine it's the sort of thing. Even if he only came back in a book someday, there has to be someone at 343 sitting looking at this story. Plus, the chance to get Eric Nylund to write another Halo book would be great.
Yeah.
So overall, what do we think of The Life and Death of Preston Cole?
It's a great story. It's really well written. It's interesting. It's an overall really good mini story to a person that we hear his name a lot in the Halo series.
Yeah, like this is, the Cole Protocol. It's one of the big things in Halo. And to get the story of the man behind it.
It's something that's mentioned. It's something that's mentioned in the first couple minutes of the first Halo.
Yeah, that's true. Like, it's just a throwaway line about the Cole Protocol.
Yeah, I like it because of how it kind of documents the key points of his life. Kind of just goes in and says but not only it talks about who he is, but each chapter or mini chapter also gives you a foreword that kind of gets you the state of the relevant universe at this point in time. Because as Cole advances through life, there's different statuses that the UNSC is in, the insurgency is in, and so it kind of gives you a little brief history lesson to kind of help put you into the mindset of what's going on in the environment that he's in. And so it gives you, there's a word I'm looking for, but it gives you sort of a relevance to
I like a context to everything.
A context, that's it. Yeah. It gives you the context of what he's living in, and that reinforces kind of what he does, and then also the way he develops and how the fight against the Covenant develops.
Yeah, I think for me, the one thing they mention in this, I think Codename Surgeon mentions it, that when they talk about this story, they actually mention how the insurrection was I think he says it's the single luckiest event to ever happen in all of human history. Because had the insurrectionists and the UNSC not started to fight in space, and had the UNSC not been forced...
They wouldn't be militarized
Yep, he says they just would not have been prepared at all. It still would have been a fleet of lightly armoured ships that could launch missiles. Because one of the other things is they talk about how Cole introduced a rule that you could no longer command or become a commander if you hadn't been an enlisted officer to begin with. Because once they realised that the war was coming, and the UNSC and then the Covenant and these people were going to be in charge, you couldn't just be someone that went and did officer training and were then given command. It's I think he says something I think anyone that hasn't been bloodied in the field of combat has no right commanding men into combat. So it sets all this up that you see where the UNSC came from, and how by the time we get to them in Combat Evolved, they've come a long way from the early days when they really weren't prepared for anything.
Yeah.
I think overall it's definitely worth reading. This is without a doubt my favourite story in Evolutions by far. It's the longest story in Evolutions, and if you enjoyed Fall of Reach and First Contact and that, you really will enjoy this too. And it sets a lot of good stuff up, and it also gives you that good fix of space combat, which I feel we've kind of gotten away from in Halo these days.
We really have.
We need to go back to more detailed, fun space combat stuff.
Read Ghosts of Onyx. There's a lot of space combat in that.
And then I have to read Legacy of Onyx. So many books. So
There's
much to keep up with.
Stop coming out with so many books, 343. Slow down.
Yeah. Alright, well I think we'll wrap it up here for today. If any of you guys have any thoughts on the life and death of Preston Cole, feel free to email us or go over to the Facebook group and drop your thoughts in there. And we're going to go and read our next book club for the holiday book clubs, and we'll get ready to record that. And until next time, Evolved.
Love you, bye, Evolved.